right? So the Brazilian farmers, on the other hand, are going to benefit a lot because they're going to be able to get computers more cheaply. And the Chinese producers will benefit more because they'll be able, computer manufacturers will benefit more because they'll be able to get sugar more cheaply. So overall, there's a social gain, but the people who were like not so efficient relative to the other country are going to do worse. So we call those people the owners of the scarce factors. Because in Brazil, places to grow sugar are very abundant. And that's the reason why it's cheap to grow sugar there. In China, factories are very abundant, and so that's why it's cheap to manufacture computers there. And the owner of the scarce thing, sugar fields in China or factories in Brazil, is going to lose from the trade. And this is what's called the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. And what economists usually advocate is that when we open up to trade, you compensate the people. You tax the people who gain, and you give some money to the people who lose, and then everyone's better off. But in practice, that can be pretty problematic. So the reason is, if you compensate people too much for having been the victims of opening up trade, well then they have an incentive to basically lobby the government to be protectionist in the beginning so that they can develop an industry and then get hurt by trade and get money from the government, right? The problem is basically that you know, any time you start paying people to compensate them for something, it makes it much easier for them to like get money from everybody else, right? And they spend a lot of money lobbying to try to be the beneficiaries of that type of subsidy. But on the other hand, when you don't compensate them, then they politically oppose opening up and making the whole economy better off. So you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. In the US, this is a particularly big problem because labor is relatively scarce in the US compared to capital, especially unskilled labor, relative to capital and skilled labor. And labor unions are therefore usually the biggest supporters of protectionism. And in fact, there's been some very interesting thinking about how we can explain big changes in political history using this type of an analysis. So one classic example was that in the 19th century in the United Kingdom, land was very scarce. The UK is a very small country relative to its population, right? Capital was very abundant. There was tons of capital, and there was tons of population, so there was a lot of labor. So that naturally led capital and labor to be in favor of free trade, and the landed aristocracy to be against free trade. On the other hand, in Germany, labor was relatively scarce. It was a very big country. Sorry, labor was relatively abundant, and both capital and land were relatively scarce because there was a very, very booming German population. This is at least the story that's told. And so that led both capital, which was relatively scarce, and land, which was relatively scarce, to be opposed to international commerce, and labor to be in favor of it. So what patterns of politics does that predict? Well, it predicts that in Britain you would get this alliance of the working class and the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. And that's exactly what you got, and how you got sort of like the Liberal Party in Britain that was sort of progressive and whatever, and then the Conservative Party who opposed them. On the other hand, when you have land and capital on one side and labor on the other side, then you end up with sort of a socialist party and a sort of fascist group. And that's exactly what happened in Germany. So this theory tried to use this logic to explain why the politics in Britain ended up being working so well and working so poorly in Germany, just because of the relative scarcity and abundance of different factors. Okay, so now the gains from trade that we just emphasized come from just the fact that Brazil is inherently good at some things and China is inherently good at others. And that's very important in many areas. For example, the China, Latin America, Africa trade is a huge huge part of that. One of the biggest things that's been fueling the economy in recent years is that China has been exporting lots of finished goods to poor countries like Latin American and African countries, and they've been producing raw materials like metals and agricultural goods. Similarly, U.S. and Latin America have a very booming trade for Latin American agricultural products and U.S. Fast food. But many of the most important gains from trade don't come from these sources. So one is what's called the Krugman model, which is that it's not obvious that Japan inherently, maybe in the 1940s, was better at producing hardware and electronics, and the U.S. would be better at producing software, which is what's ended up happening. But both of them sort of more or less randomly decided to specialize in one of the areas, right? And that was in both of their interests, right? And that's what we do in our society all the time. You guys are all going to choose some career to go into. You'll get good at that. I mean, maybe you're a little bit better at that than somebody else, but most of it comes from your choosing to train to become good at that, right? And this was what Adam Smith discussed when he made the model of a pin factory. So he said that in a pin factory, everyone specializes in some particular task, not because they're inherently better at it, but just because they can become better at it by doing it all the time and not having to constantly switch between different tasks. And so everyone in the world can gain by every country focusing on being good at some particular thing, even if inherently they're no better. So you can sort of endogenously get comparative advantage. Another thing that can be very beneficial about trade, remember we talked on Tuesday about the fact that there are some sort of very exceptionally talented people. And there's naturally going to be a very small number of those in any given country. When you open up to different countries, all of the most talented people from each country can bring the best things from their country all over the world, right? So if trade wasn't open, it's not that, inherently Americans are better at producing consumer electronics than the Japanese. Quite the opposite, actually. If anything, the opposite. But Steve Jobs happened to be this amazing guy. And so now he's colonized China. And on the other hand, in some areas, there's a ton of Japanese products that were created by the most brilliant Japanese engineers, which have colonized the U.S. market. And everyone's better off as a result of that because you can take advantage of the rare geniuses in all these different countries. That's sometimes called the Melitz model. And there's lots of other logics that are sort of similar to these, but they all sort of have a quite similar flavor. Okay, so now let's talk about the comparative statics of equilibrium. So imagine that a subsidy is given in a market or that the supply rises at any given price. What do you think would happen? Well, you'd expect that the quantity is going to rise and the price to consumers is going to fall, right? And the way that this is just the normal supply and demand diagram, right? Yeah, Bill.
I thought it was the other one around. There are farm subsidies, isn't it? The government gives the farmers subsidies and they don't have to produce as much. And doesn't that keep the price?
Yeah, but that's a subsidy for non-production. Here we're thinking about a subsidy for production. So you get $1 for every unit you bring to market. Okay. So this is still true, but I want to look at it a little bit more carefully and mathematically. So let's just think about it as an equation. So if subsidy is S, imagine we just create some more of the product. So we don't give a subsidy. We just create some more of the product. You would think that would drive down the price, right? That's our most basic intuition about how markets work. If there's more stuff available, the price will be lower, right? And we can represent that by this equation. Supply as a function of price is equal to demand as a function of price plus the extra supply that we added to the market, right? Now, if we just solve this out using the implicit function theorem, does anyone want to do that? Okay, I'll just do it. So we get, right, that we differentiate this with respect to S, we get 1. Here we get S prime times dp ds, right? And here we get d prime times dp ds, right? And so then if you just solve that out, you get that how much the price changes when the supply increases is 1 over the slope of demand minus the slope of supply with respect to price. Now, this is like the classical formula for the effect of an increase in supply. And why does this have to be negative? Why does the price go down when the supply increases? Well, it's because the demand slopes downward, so this is negative, and the supply slopes upward, so this is positive. But notice that you don't really need that, right? You don't actually, in order for this to be negative, you don't need that demand slopes downward or that supply slopes upward. What you need is that demand slopes downward relative to supply. So they could both be sloping upward, but demand could be sloping upward more slowly, or they could both be sloping downward, but supply could be sloping downward less quickly, but more slowly as well. And that would be sufficient, right? And the reason why this is very reasonable is that if demand didn't sort of cut supply from above, if it didn't slope downward more quickly than supply, then imagine that we start at equilibrium. If we raise the price by a little bit, right, then the supply is going to be greater than the demand is. Sorry, the demand is going to be greater than the supply if the price rises by a little bit, if demand slopes upward more quickly than supply does, right? So a slight rise in price would cause demand to be greater than supply. But when demand is greater than supply, that drives up the price, right? And so that would make demand even greater than supply. And that would drive the price up more, and things would go out of control. So you're going to trace through that process a lot on your problem set, so I won't go through it too much. But what this says is that what's required is that the difference between demand and supply, what we call the excess demand, that's what we call demand minus supply, has to be stable. That is, the slope of the excess demand function has to be less than 0. That's a really crucial condition, and that's going to do two things. That's both going to ensure that what we're actually talking about is an actual equilibrium. It's not one of these situations where if you raise the price by a little bit, it just keeps going up. And it's going to ensure that when you increase the supply, the price falls. So the same things that lead to sort of the natural comparative static properties that we usually think about are exactly those that are required for a market to be stable. This is what's called the correspondence principle. So the correspondence principle says that stability is equivalent to the correct comparative statics. Okay, so let me just draw you a graph of this. So the typical picture that we have is that so demand, which I'll draw in red, slopes downward, and supply, which I'll draw in blue, slopes upward, right? And let me actually do this slightly differently than usual. Let me put price on the horizontal axis and quantity on the vertical axis. Okay? So then, if we were to increase the supply curve, right, what would that mean? We want to add 1 unit of quantity to it for each price. That would move up to here, and that would lead the price to fall because that's on the horizontal axis. Right? Yeah, go.
Why did you switch the axis?
You'll see in a second. It's going to be confusing if I do it the other way around. You'll see why.
But then doesn't this effectively flip, like it makes demand slope upward? So
Your demand still slopes downward, right? Because as the price increases, quantity decreases. And supply slopes upward still, because as price increases, quantity increases, right? Okay. Now, that's the simple case. But now suppose that we want to look at a case where demand might actually slope upward, right? So if demand